Where should I sit? That's your choice, really. And you can have powder back. I can't.
Complexity almost always begins with a question. Let me start. When you think of Vi, what's the first thing that comes to mind? For me, it's always her relationship with Jinx and Caitlyn. For Jinx, the first thing that comes to mind is her mental state. For Jayce, it's the council. Now, you might think these are all just because of how the story happened, but actually, it's the other way around. You see, Arcane is what you call a character-driven story or narrative, and that's actually what makes the characters of the story so complex. A character-driven story is like letting the character decide what they want to happen based on how they feel or what they want. This decision is almost always backed up by a question. So, if one character is really brave, they might decide to go on a quest or maybe lead a rebellion. If another character is scared, maybe they try to look for a place to hide, or maybe they'll have something to prove. If another character is ambitious, maybe they want to do something that can change the dynamics of the world at large. In a character-driven story, what happens depends on who the characters are and how they feel. Things don't just happen because there's a bad guy they need to beat. It's more about why they made their decisions and what the answers to their questions are. That's also why Victor tells Jayce that there's always a choice. It's because it's their choices that are going to shape the story. That quote in itself is prodding our characters to ask questions. However, when our characters do act on those choices, there will always be conflicts that they need to overcome. And with each conflict, there are different kinds of questions to be answered. The special thing with Arcane is that they were able to make each character represent a different kind of conflict with each storyline. For Vi, her main conflict is called an interpersonal conflict. I think it's the most common among movies and TV shows in general, but less so for books. Do you remember how Vi is always with somebody during the series? I mean, all throughout her storyline and perspective, Vi has always had to deal with other people and get past them. During Act 1, she was always with Vander, Powder, and the rest of her foster family. The main conflict of this was between her and Vander. She wanted war, but Vander did not. In Act 2, she was always with Caitlyn, Savika, or Jinx. Her main conflict was actually with Silco, but since she was always with Caitlyn, it was them that kept on butting heads. At the end of the act, she now had to deal with the conflict between her, Caitlyn, and Jinx. In Act 3, she was either with Caitlyn, Echo, Jayce, and the list goes on. Are you seeing a pattern here? In Act 3, she was thrust upon the Council of Piltover, but her conflict was never really about them. Instead, the conflict surrounding her went back to her relationship with Caitlyn, her partnership with Jayce, and in the end, it was a culmination of her relationship with Jinx. In each of those acts, her main interactions weren't with herself or the larger institutions of Piltover or Zon. Her main interactions were always directed at the people around her. Her problems revolved around Powder, Vander, Caitlyn, Echo, Savika, and even Jayce. That's also why all the characters felt so grounded and complex. They were actually based on relationships people actually had. All the writers had to do was to ask the right questions surrounding those relationships. For example, a question that could have been asked from Vi's perspective is, how are you going to salvage things with your sister after what happened? Or it could also be, how are you going to make amends with your significant other? So these questions are pretty simple, right? But as time goes on, the events and the context surrounding it usually gets more complicated. So it's pretty much like real life in how simple things usually turn into complicated messes. For Jinx, she's mainly in conflict with herself, making her main conflict an intrapersonal conflict. In Act 1, she was struggling with having been belittled and compared to Vi, ultimately making her trying to prove herself to Vi and her foster family. If you watch the series, then you all know how that ended. Act 2 is basically her juggling all the insecurities that she had from Act 1 with the added bonus of the trauma that she acquired along the way. The one she was now trying to prove herself to was Silco, thinking that Vi is dead, hence her stealing the Hex Gem. Aside from Silco and Savika, we don't really see her interacting with other people except for her hallucinations of Milo and Clagor. Even then, proportionately, she spent her time alone and thinking to herself. Act 3 is where she ultimately breaks as a result of all the insecurities and trauma, as well as the Shimmer injection. But notice this, even when faced with Vi, Caitlyn, and Silco, she still had moments when she was talking to herself. Ever since Act 1, it was an internal battle with her doubts and insecurities, leading to all the events that basically doomed them in Season 1. The accumulated trauma after Act 1 didn't help either. With this kind of conflict, the types of questions you ask yourself are, am I good enough? Or, if I do this, will they accept me then? Or even, did I do something wrong again? These are actually insecurities that all people have at any age, with any race, and with any social standing. For the misunderstood Jayce, he has to deal with arguably the most complicated conflict known to man, extrapersonal conflict. In Act 1, Jayce was doing something so big that an immortal hamster couldn't even grasp it. In essence, Jayce was challenging the status quo. For 200 years, magic was banned, but he sincerely thought that he could change that. And you know what? He actually did it. In Act 2, he was thrust in the political machinations of Mel and the Council. He was a scientist, and he didn't even know where to begin navigating the political landscape of Piltover. This left him lost and susceptible to the manipulations of his fellow council members. In Act 3, he grew tired of all the injustices that he realized just can't be changed. It was already too big. What little he could do to enact any real change was treated as a swan song because he knew he'd be targeted for doing something right. Did you know that extrapersonal conflict is actually a blanket term and it actually covers two other kinds of conflict? One conflict is man against nature, and the other conflict is man against society. So it's really no wonder that Jayce floundered in his position. I mean, those are some pretty impossible walls to scale. To scale them both at once, well, that's a very tall order. Anyway, the questions the writers could have asked were, am I doing the right thing based on the information I have? Or what will it take to change this? Or even, what is the right thing to do for everybody? You know, Jayce gets a lot of hate, but it's often because he's misunderstood. And the troubles he faces aren't the troubles that a lot of people face. But you know what? I have a feeling that upper and middle management will get him right away. I mean, the good ones at least. The bad ones would resonate more with the other council members. It's ironic that in order to make such complex characters, all the writers of Arcane had to do was ask simple questions. This then established causality and would then become the reason on why characters would do the things they do. From there, it was a highly complicated task of weaving these answers and choices into one coherent narrative that the audience could resonate with and show the wider struggles of the people around us. I'll talk more about the characters of Arcane right here, so I hope to see you there. Peace and have a great day.